So before I begin, I'm going to answer the question you're all thinking. No, my wife did not see me before I left the house today. She's in North Carolina for the weekend. So you can all blame me, not her. Grace to you and peace from God who is, who was, and who is to come. Amen. I know it's July, and we not only have this great heat wave outside, we're experiencing one inside because of our 23-year-old HVAC system. But I realize that I am going to start off here probably being on the proverbial thin ice, because these next couple of chapters that we have in Romans, Paul talks about something that is, I think we can say, has become very sensitive in our culture. Paul discusses how believers should respond to the government. Now, do you remember last week when Pastor Horner was talking about how Paul wants all believers to get along with each other, regardless of their ethnic heritage or their economic position or their immigration status, how believers are to treat one another with dignity and respect? Paul continues that idea, and he says that we are also to respect the government, which for Paul means we are to obey the government. But I think that the difficulty for us hearing this today is that the government that Paul is dealing with is much, much different than the government of our 21st century United States. Paul's dealing with the mid-first century Rome. Specifically, he's coming off of the reign of Claudius. Remember, Claudius is the guy who banned all of the Jews from Rome, and entering into the time of Nero. Now, Nero will become one of the more notorious emperors, but at that point, when Paul is writing, he's not there yet. And so Paul sees the Roman government as an extension, an agent of God's will here on earth. This is how Paul begins Romans chapter 13. This is the New Revised Standard Version. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. To put that in more modern English, this is Eugene Peterson's version called The Message. Be a good citizen. All governments are under God. Insofar as there is peace and order, it's God's order. So live responsibly as a citizen. If you're irresponsible to the state, then you're irresponsible with God, and God will hold you responsible. All governments are under God. If you're irresponsible to the state, you are irresponsible with God. Is that something that we 21st century North Americans can agree with? You see, like I said, when Paul is writing this letter, his view of the government is relatively positive. The Roman government has not yet begun to actively hunt down and persecute Christians. It will do so, and actually within a relatively short amount of time from when Paul is writing this letter, but at that time the government hasn't started. Paul sees the Roman government in general in more of a positive nature than negative, at least for the average citizen. If you do what the government says, if you pay your taxes, if you don't do illegal stuff, if you don't rock the boat, or, as Jesus said back in Matthew, if you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, then, Paul says, the government is not only going to leave you alone, but the government is seen as an extension of God at work in the world today. But how many of us have that understanding of government? Whichever government it might be, the local, state, national, international, do we see government in general as an instrument for good? Or is our view of government in general, shall we say, maybe less than positive? And I say that because I know that we've had a couple of contentious national elections in the past 10-ish years or so, and we're entering into our next round. November 2024 is not that far off. Interesting people were elected, interesting people have been elected, interesting people are going to be elected. And as has been the case with every politician ever elected throughout the history of humanity, controversial things were said or done or implied by many politicians, so much so that in a relatively recent Pew Research Center poll, they discovered that only 2 out of 10 Americans say that they trust the government in Washington to do what is right just about always or most of the time. 2 out of 10 trust the government to do the right thing. That's across the board. That's no specific political party. That's across the board. 2 out of 10 Americans trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. For believers, I think this Romans passage is a tough one to try to come in terms with. In part because too often it's been interpreted that we are to blindly follow the government, because all government has been appointed by God. That's how governments acted back in the medieval ages. That's how monarchies were able to stay in power. They claimed to be in power because God gave them the authority to be there. I would argue that this passage is calling believers to be good, supportive citizens, which also means we are to call upon our governments to be responsible. This passage is calling for governments to take care of its citizens. Then, and only then, so long as the government is abiding by God, then we are called to serve God by obeying the government. We are called to hold our government responsible in order that together all of us may serve God. Now, Paul goes on to talk about how serving God by obeying the government, what it looks like. He says in verse 8, "Owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are all summed up in this word: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." Paul doesn't say anything about loving only legal citizens. Paul doesn't comment about caring only for specific gender orientations. Instead, Paul does this incredibly radical thing. He quotes Jesus: "Love your neighbor as yourself." And he doesn't go into specifics. He doesn't say who is or isn't our neighbor. So I believe that Paul is very bluntly telling the Romans, and thereby all of us, who our neighbors are. He's telling us, love everyone. We might be forgiven, Paul says, yet we are still called to live honorably. Don't revel in drunkenness or debauchery or licentiousness. I love that word. Don't quarrel or be jealous. Welcome all believers, regardless of how strong their faith may or may not be. Just don't do things on purpose to trip up other believers. Just because my faith isn't the same as your faith doesn't mean that mine is automatically superior. Some people worship best with pipe organs and chancel choirs. Others are deeply moved by a praise band, or there are those who really enjoy just a piano at worship. Some people like a short and pithy sermon, straight and to the point. Others appreciate a longer, almost more like a Bible study in order to really delve into scriptures. There's nothing wrong with any of that, Paul says. Okay, Paul uses different examples. He talks about festivals to the full moon and new idols, but we can't relate to those. We do understand organ versus praise band. We do understand short sermons compared to long sermons. We do understand receiving communion in a prepackaged cup as compared to coming forward and receiving a wafer in your hand and dipping it into the chalice. Don't judge others, Paul says, because we are all in this together. We need other believers in our lives. We learn from one another. Faith is not meant to be walked alone. Gather together with other believers. Faith is not meant to be lived in a vacuum. Live your faith outside of Sunday morning when you go out into the world. Verse 19, let us agree to use all our energy in getting along with each other. Help others with encouraging words. Don't drag them down by finding fault. Be a good citizen by holding our government accountable to take care of its citizens. Be a good witness of Christ's love and forgiveness by loving our neighbors, regardless of their ethnic heritage or legal status or orientation or economic position or educational background or employment setting. Love your neighbor as yourself, because that's how we follow Jesus and impact lives. Amen.